You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 17th of June 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio 4 here at Dufourstrasse 90 in Zurich. I'm Andrew Muller. Coming up on today's programme.
Iran basically is at the negotiating table. They want to make a deal. And as soon as I leave here, we're going to be doing something. But I have to leave here.
US President Donald Trump loses interest in the G7. Iran suddenly acquires interest in negotiations over its nuclear program. Also ahead, did the G7 shift President Trump's belief in the utility of tariffs, especially when imposed on America's nominal allies? Later in the show, we'll talk to Monocle correspondents at the Abu Dhabi Infrastructure Summit and at Pitti Uomo in Florence. And
hello, this is Chris Chermak here in Zurich. And Andrew, I'm going to be talking about Austria and some important happenings in Vienna this week. Volodymyr Zelensky was there. The IAEA had a Board of Governors meeting. Also talk of tightening gun laws.
More from Chris later in the show. That's all coming up right here on The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And welcome to today's edition of The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. Plausible reporting has it that Iran has decided, what with one thing and another, that perhaps there is merit after all in negotiating over the future of its nuclear program. Iran has been furiously signalling to Arab intermediaries that it would be willing to resume talks, though after 5 days of bombardment by Israel, it is not entirely clear how much of a nuclear program Iran still has. Well, I'm joined first of all by Nora Meyer, Deputy CEO and co-founder of Amble Meyer Negotiation Consulting. Nora, being as you are a professional in negotiations and conflict resolutions, what signal do you think Iran is trying to send here? Is it please stop bombing us?
I think what is left for Iran is, I would say, maybe three options. So they have an option. They could decide to now, with these, with the attacks, we're going to build a bomb. I don't know if that's technically feasible, but that could be a reaction to what's going on. Another option would be to maybe close the Strait of Hormuz. That could be another way to react. And then there is the third option, which I think, and it seems like they have come to the conclusion that's their best bet at the moment, is to negotiate around a nuclear program. So that's what it seems like they have arrived at this point.
But looking at that from Iran's point of view, if that is what they do now want to do, negotiate about the future of their nuclear program, what is the incentive for anybody else to turn up at those talks? They are in a massively weaker position than they were a week ago.
I think maybe the question here is, who is anyone to have an incentive, right? I think essentially there are the three parties. It's Iran, it's Israel, and it's the US. So I think these are the key players in these negotiations. The incentives, I would say, for all of them, I would say none of them has an interest in having a prolonged war, because that is costly. It's domestically also difficult to sell. We can see that now with, for example, the US in the Republican Party being split. So I think that's an incentive they could all share, negotiating to avoid having a prolonged war. And then, of course, it's also for Iran, as you said, they're in a weaker position as they even were a week ago. They have a population, they're suffering under the sanctions. They have been suffering for quite some time. So I think also domestically for them, it is to not have an uprising from the population. So I think it's domestic elements as well as the prolonged effects of a war.
But is it not the case that something has changed in the balance here? Because there's been negotiations going on for years over Iran's nuclear program. There was at one time an agreement signed, the JCPOA, before Donald Trump pulled the plug on it during his first term. But the thing that nobody said out loud that everybody must have known is that ultimately it was always going to be Israel that decided how far this process would go and at what point Iran's nuclear program would be stopped. And the cat is well and truly out of the bag now, isn't it? Everybody understands that Israel is ultimately the decision maker here.
Yeah, I think it's not in Israel's interest to have a negotiation around a nuclear deal. I think their goal would be to actually have no nuclear program at all, right? And it seems like they have now tied this element of not having a nuclear program with also eliminating the regime. So they say there cannot be no program with this regime. So that's been tied together. But yes, even in 2015, it was not in Israel's interest, and they were opposing the JCPOA, as you said. And it seems like, yes, Israel has an influence on the U.S. decision makers as well. We can see that now also with Trump's reaction to the attacks starting. And also with, I would say, the G7 statement that came out yesterday. So I think we can see a certain influence, and we can see the key players in this conflict.
Just finally on this one, because I do want to talk to you a bit about Russia and Ukraine as well, but from Iran's point of view, if it is true that they are trying to restart talks, what is their offer at this point? Because everybody knew what the offer was. We will scale back enrichment, we will close down some centrifuges, we will keep ourselves a reasonable threshold from the point at which we could build a deliverable nuclear weapon. A lot of that they cannot offer anymore. So what is their pitch at this point?
What they could offer is just in general being a constructive partner, a partner in that area that helps to foster peace and security. So they can also try to offer for any attacks of their acts of the resistance for these attacks to cease. So that is something they can offer. And essentially, that would be something that everyone in this area would have an interest in as well.
Well, we will see how this plays out over coming days. But yeah, while we do have you here, it does seem silly not to ask you about Ukraine and Russia, because the dynamics of that conflict at least seem to have stayed fairly solid for quite a while now. Did you read anything from the G7 that suggested that anything has shifted? We know Donald Trump left early, certainly too early to actually have the conversation with President Zelensky of Ukraine that he was supposed to have. But is the fundamental problem that there's no incentive as yet for Russia to stop doing what it's doing?
Yeah, I think so. There is no incentive. It seems like there's this theory of conflict rightness, that a conflict is only ripe if both parties, or however many parties you have in a conflict, come to the realization that it's better for them to achieve their goals by ways of negotiation. And it seems like Russia is still of the opinion that they can reach their goals by military means. So I think, yes, there is no or a lack of incentive for Russia to do that. But also at the same time, I would like to emphasize that there is not enough pressure to create the incentive for Russia to actually having to commit to serious negotiations.
But just as a final thought on that, do you see any means of pressure that could be applied to Russia that have not already been applied? I mean, considerable military assistance has been sent to Ukraine, not quite everything Ukraine wanted as fast as Ukraine wanted it, but nonetheless considerable. We are now up to, I think, the 18th round of EU sanctions on Russia. None of that's made a difference. What's left?
Yeah, I think at this point, yes, you mentioned the EU, and even having the EU being torn, like there were parties that said from the beginning, we need to prevent Russia's victory, or we need, then the other parties who said that we need Ukraine to win. Those are complement. They're different opinions, so I think we still see that. But that would be effective, right, to have sanction packets or weapon support from the EU. I don't think it's likely going to change. As you said, there have been 18 rounds. I don't think it's going to ever be enough to actually have Ukraine win this war militarily. Another option would be for President Trump to use his power and his influence to bring Russia to the negotiation table. At the same time, it doesn't look like that's happening at the moment. On the contrary, he seems to have lost interest in this conflict. He wasn't able to provide this quick win as he was promising. And he is now, as you said, the G7, he left early. He doesn't seem to have the interest to even discuss this conflict. And he's leaving it to the EU and maybe the other NATO members.
Nora Meyer, thank you for joining us. That was Nora Meyer, Senior Consultant and Co-Founder of Ambel-Meyer Negotiation Consulting. You're listening to The Briefing. Here is Anita Riota in London with the day's other headlines.
Thanks, Andrew. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security has reportedly reversed its guidance for agents not to conduct immigration raids at farms and hospitality services. The move comes as a U-turn on President Trump's initial directive to not affect the workforce of those industries. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer is expected to announce fresh sanctions on Russia today in tandem with Britain's G7 allies. The sanctions package is set to hit Russia's energy revenues. Airbus has secured nearly $10 billion worth of orders at the Paris Air Show. The French plane maker dominated the first day of the industry event as rival Boeing scaled back its activities following last week's fatal Air India crash. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Anita. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio from our studios here in Zurich. And sticking with the G7, for much of his brief time at the event, US President Donald Trump resumed complaining that it was no longer the G8 since the ejection of Russia in 2014. And then Trump turned it into the G6 by leaving early, at first saying this was because of the conflict in the Middle East and then seeming to suggest that it wasn't. Before leaving, however, Trump did sign agreements which would further a trade deal between the US and the UK, although judging by his remarks shortly after dropping the pertinent papers all over the floor, seemed to believe he had actually concluded trade arrangements with the EU. Well, joining us now in the studio with the unenviable task of making sense of any of that is Fabian Kinzelmann, International Economy Editor at Switzerland's Handelszeitung. Fabian, if we assume that what was actually done here was a deal between the US and the UK, which is certainly what the UK's Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, possibly a more reliable witness, thinks. Is that potentially a big deal?
Yeah, assuming that it will take effect as it looks like right now. It's at least the first one to be announced since Trump announced all the big tariffs in the beginning of the year. And while everyone is trying to make it look like a big thing, it's actually more limited than the UK, like Downing Street 10 has expected. Because there's no removal for steel imports, for example. And
I mean, tariffs were obviously a major talking point at this summit. And we seem to get further insight into just the whimsical, arbitrary nature of them. Trump saying that the UK would be protected against future tariffs because, and I quote, I like them. And does the rest of the world now just have to adjust to the fact that this is how trade policy is decided?
Well, it's not only a thing of like now that it's coming into effect. It was also in the first Trump presidency. World leaders who are meeting with Trump, they are preparing for exactly this to happen. And they know that the only thing that might move him is like loyalty, flattery, and maybe a little bit of fear.
I mean, it does seem like a really odd way for international trade to work. Is this an entirely new thing, or has international trade historically rested on such dynamics before?
That would be a question for the historians, but for sure, like it was not the atmosphere, the international atmosphere in the past decades. But of course, like also with like sanctions becoming more and more, like we are moving, like all Western nations are moving away. A little bit away from open markets, and with Trump, who is a protectionist, who puts America first, being the mightiest man in the world, it's definitely having an influence on how trade is shifting globally.
But do we see that retreat into protectionism? And you're right to point out that it's not just the United States. Is it having a broad effect on global trade? Is it actually slowing things up?
Definitely, we are already seeing that like the streams of goods are shifting, and not only like with the countries directly impacted, like for example the UK, like the UK car exports to the US slowed down, but also in other parts of the world. It's just like with this global atmosphere of like trade that's like putting everything kind of on pause.
I mean, but has there become, I guess, or has there arisen a school of economic thought suggesting that maybe tariffs are a good thing in the current global climate? Because what we hear from Trump, who is the world's foremost advocate of tariffs, is tariffs are good because I think they're good. It is kind of a circular argument. But is anybody trying to make the case beyond that for the advantages of them?
There are definitely some people, but it's definitely like from all economists and the leading economists right now globally, It's a very, very fast minority.
And we should ask just finally about what we saw at the G7 in terms of relations, cross-border relations between the United States and Canada. Obviously, there has been a bit of history there recently. Donald Trump threatening the conquest of Canada to become the 51st state, a stance to which current Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney may actually owe his job, ironically enough. But did you get the sense that either the President and the Prime Minister or the two countries are getting on any better than they were?
Definitely, yeah. The vibe is shifting, and that's due to Carney's efforts. Like he went on kind of a charm tour within the past month. He flattered the president. He called him directly, which we all know that Trump likes very, very much. And he also, like ahead of the G7 summit, for example, he pledged to meet the NATO's spending target much earlier than expected. So that was something the White House reportedly was very thrilled about.
Fabian Kinzelmann, International Economy Editor at Switzerland's Handelszeitung, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio, coming to you live from Monocle's Zurich studios. We have come to take for granted the idea of the Gulf Emirates as gleaming modern cities of ambitious glass and steel skyscrapers, but a look at photos of them taken just a few decades ago will remind how recently this has happened. Accordingly, Abu Dhabi is an appropriate location for an infrastructure summit, and such an event is underway as of today. Among the attendees is Monocle's Editor-in-Chief, Andrew Tuck, who joins me now from Abu Dhabi. Andrew, first of all, can you give us a sense of what a global infrastructure summit looks like? It being Abu Dhabi, I'm assuming they've done nothing by halves.
Well, kind of, but actually it's a really interesting event. There's a plenary hall where some of the debates are happening, most of the debates. There's another side area where we are with all the media teams, and there's another little stage there where they're announcing lots of deals that are being done, and there's a few exhibition stands. But actually, it's not overblown, and I think that chimes with what's going on here. That is, they're trying to shift a little bit from being the talk about towers and gleaming office buildings. Oddly, they're talking more about the softer sides of how you make a city, because they're out to attract people to come and live here, not just for a couple of years to earn some money tax-free and then go back to wherever they came from. They're out to build a community for the long term, and they want people to come and live here. So it's the softer bits, oddly, of the infrastructure deal that they're talking about.
So what kind of things specifically are they talking about within that? If they've built the spectacle, if they've built the great gleaming cities, what do they maybe now think they missed out on or forgotten about?
Well, again, Andrew, and I think both you and me probably come at this slightly from the wrong angle, because interesting as I've been interviewing people across the day, I've come to the realization that perhaps we're a bit snooty. We think that they need us and they need to bring in all these people for their deals. Interestingly, because they've been building in a very hot climate, they've been having to face some really big questions around sustainability. How the hell are you going to get people walking and cycling? It's 35 degrees outside this building at the moment. How do you do that even on a summer's day? How can that be done? So they've got a lot of intelligence here and a lot of skill sets here that they can also offer the world. So first of all, it is a bit of a dialogue, but some of the things that they're kind of engineering, and again, I thought this was amazing. We just interviewed a guy called Talal Faris. Now, he's got one of those job titles that doesn't exactly trip off the tongue. He's the Division Manager of Inclusive Communities at the Department of Community Development. Okay, now let's explain what that means. He's thinking about senior citizens. How do they get around this city? Now, people who are Emiratis still live in family compounds, still don't get shoved off to old age pensioners' homes, but they still want some independence. How do they get around? How do people who are less abled Emiratis or even expats living here, how do they navigate the city? So the really cool thing is, that because they're still building so much, 600 projects in the pipeline, some $56 billion already earmarked for that. they can think about that now. They can say to people building a building or building a leisure centre or building a theme park, make sure that anybody can get around, whether they're in a wheelchair, whether they're old, whether they're young. And the other funny thing is, as you know, Andrew, about this part of the world is there's a really clear operational structure in these places. That Abu Dhabi is a country, but it's like one amazing company as well. So if you have the leadership involved and saying, let's make sure that every building is inclusive, do you know what it happens? So the fascinating thing to me is, just think, in like 5-10 years, this could be like the leader in that kind of conversation. We can't retrofit our buildings quick enough in Europe. So they could become the go-to place for tourists who are less abled to come and visit.
So is there an argument then that maybe they are at the vanguard of adjusting in particular to rising temperatures and a warming climate? Because they are, of course, in that part of the world starting out from a pretty high baseline anyway.
Yes, I think that they, especially Abu Dhabi. So Abu Dhabi, if people who haven't been here, it is not Dubai and it's not Oman. Each one of these places has its own distinct way of doing things. And they are building mostly low-rise, well, a lot of low-rise. They're building low-rise communities, hundreds and hundreds of family units around parks with cycle lanes, shaded by trees, which they've learnt how to do over time. We had another gentleman who works for one of the biggest companies, Miral, which they're on Saudi Island, they're on Yas Island, they're building the new Disney, for example. Now, he was saying that during Eid, which is peak summer, so as hot as you can get, they were as busy as during the cool months of Christmas, because they've engineered these buildings to be accessible, places of refuge from the heat, fun places to go when it's stinky hot. I know where we'll go. We'll go to Yas Island. So they've managed to engineer all of those things. So look, nowhere has all the answers, but I also think it's interesting that they're really keen to have a dialogue. And one last boring thing, Andrew, but I think also interesting to see it on the list is like dispute resolution, the legal framework, how you make stuff happen. That's also being discussed here, because they want to say to people, if you come here, we're not going to screw you over. You come here, there's a legal framework that if there is a dispute with somebody who's local, we will look after you. And I think that's the other funny thing about here is like, even on the tougher nitty-gritty things about how you get things done, they're steaming ahead. One last thing, we had a gentleman come on who's doing a lot of work in Spain, and he's doing a lot of work here building communities. He said in like they've got a project in Spain. 2 years down the line, they haven't put a spade into the earth yet. In that 2 years, they had a project kick off here in Abu Dhabi. They built 5,500 units and they were done. So that's also, that framework stuff is really fascinating.
Andrew Tuck at the Abu Dhabi Infrastructure Summit. Thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio with me, Andrew Muller. As we may have mentioned once or twice, and by golly may mention once or twice more, we are broadcasting The Briefing and The Daily out of Zurich all this week, which puts us, of course, one country away from Austria. And joining me here in Zurich for a wrap-up of news from the neighbour is Monocle's senior news editor and Austrian, Chris Cermak. Chris, first of all, as we were discussing earlier at the top of the show, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky did not get a meeting with Donald Trump in Canada, which is doubtless a considerable relief to both of them. But Zelensky may have better luck getting his calls returned in Vienna.
Well, he was actually in Vienna, so yes, he did have some luck there. Before we get to that, Andrew, can I just say, given that we're currently in Zurich, my happiest moment was yesterday. I won't name the contributor, but somebody did say that Austria is the better Switzerland, so that is why we are currently discussing Austria as well on this show. But
I would encourage Swiss listeners to direct their complaints to Chris Cermak directly and not Monocle as an organisation.
To your point of Zelensky, I mean, there's been a lot happening in Austria in the last couple of days, which is why I wanted to do a bit of this segment. And yes, it was interesting that Volodymyr Zelensky was in Vienna. It was the first time that he visited Vienna since the start of the full-scale war with Russia. He met both with the president, Alexander Van der Bellen, and the Chancellor, Christian Stocker. Austria obviously is neutral. It is a neutral nation, not part of NATO. Van der Bellen, the president, made the point of saying we may be militarily neutral, but we are not politically neutral. Austria has backed sanctions, the EU sanctions against Ukraine. And the two countries signed a series of deals that were, again, not military, but in other issues, demining, energy, cybersecurity help, things like that. So this meeting was a bit of a sign that things are changing in Austria under this government, that there is a willingness to support Ukraine that there hasn't always been.
Well, we should talk about the deliberations of another body of people who I suspect are having a somewhat sleepless week. This is the International Atomic Energy Agency.
Yeah, so the IAEA is also in Vienna, and they held a meeting of their board of governors yesterday. And what's interesting is, you know, there's lots of reasons we can debate and have been debated about why Israel started its attack on Iran on Friday. But one thing that certainly came before that was the IAEA in another meeting on Thursday for the first time basically saying that Iran was in non-compliance when it came to the nuclear deal and its agreements on nuclear security and building potentially nuclear weapons. They met again on Monday, and it was a pretty rambunctious meeting of the Board of Governors. You had a group of countries backed by Iran, if you will, including China and Russia and others, that condemned the IAEA and condemned Israel for its attack on Iran. But then you, of course, had the West, the U.S. as well, that were defending the IAEA, saying it shouldn't fall on the fact that the IAEA declared Iran non-compliant as some kind of reason for, you know, there shouldn't be a link there to Israel's attack. The IAEA is doing what it is supposed to do. It is monitoring Iran's nuclear program, and it found them to be non-compliant. So it was a pretty difficult meeting of the IAEA yesterday.
And just finally, Chris, the political fallout from that dreadful school shooting in Graz, talk about toughening Austria's gun laws. How tough or otherwise were they?
Well, this is what's interesting, because Austria is actually more lax, a bit more liberal than other European countries are. Not quite as lax as the United States, which would be my other country, of course. But nonetheless, this was an awful attack by a 21-year-old in Graz and killed 10 people, including students. And he acquired both of the weapons that he used legally, a Glock pistol and a shotgun, which goes to show you that the laws in Austria are a little more relaxed. You do need a license, but lots of Austrians, including Graz's mayor, has complained that licenses for guns are, in the words of Mayor Elke K., simply issued too quickly in Austria, and that this has become a problem. So now, yes, the Austrian Chancellor, Christian Stocker, has announced that gun laws will be tightened. They haven't given specifics, but it's certainly been a big debate across Austria since that attack. There's been 400,000 more firearms now than 5 years ago in Austria, so we've seen a boost in the number of firearms, and now they're going to be looking to roll that back.
Chris Cermak, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio, live from Zurich, and sticking with the theme of neighbouring countries, Pitti Uomo is underway in Florence, from where I am joined by Monocle Associate Editor for Design and Fashion, Grace Charlton. Grace, first of all, give us a view from inside the belly of, or beast seems the wrong word. You know what I'm saying. What is it like being in the middle of Pitti Uomo right now?
I'm not going to lie, it feels like being very underdressed. All the men here just look sensational. They're wearing linen suits. They've got, super shiny shoes on, sunglasses. But it's raining quite heavily at the moment, and I'm looking out the window, and I don't think enough people considered the accessory of the umbrella. So that's putting a little bit of a damper on the situation.
Literally as well as spiritually, one would think. What you've described there, Grace, is a setting in which it does not sound like I would fit in tremendously well. But beyond that, are you noticing any particular trends emerging already?
Well, actually, I think you might be able to fit in well because there are quite a few funky shirts, Andrew.
Hooray.
Had with I know you're in style. And a lot of people are wearing a little cotton bandana tied around the neck, sort of like a little cowboy touch to an outfit, even though I'm pretty sure no one here has ever been on a horse.
I mean,
Yeah.
are the bandanas of any particular colour? Do they signify anything, or are people just going hog wild and doing what they will?
It's very multicolored, very patterned, to offset the beige linen suit, maybe. I've spoke to a few people and they said they wanted a more casual alternative to the tie. So I think that's the reasoning behind the little kerchief, you know.
I mean, probably more seriously, we should talk about the fashion market generally. At the previous Pity 6 months ago, I recall you speaking about there being a kind of optimism in the air. Has that endured?
No, it's so interesting, like what a difference 6 months have made. There's so much more anxiety this year, especially because of Trump and the tariffs. You know, when I was here in January, people kept on saying that the US is a really important market, and now it seems that the strategy is maybe more to recenter on Europe and solidify presence in Europe rather than trying to expand elsewhere. So yeah, it's fun to be here and see the suits, but it's true that it's a business event and a trade fair, and people's livelihoods.
Well, we will finish then by talking about the fashion rather than the business. It says here, Grace, that I am to ask you about boat life.
Oh, I'm so glad you're hosting the briefing today. It's the boat life trend is I've noticed everyone seems to be pushing this idea of the yacht yuppie, as I'm going to coin it. There are lots of polo shirts, boat shoes, sunglasses. It's very Saint-Tropez. It's very Mediterranean. The brands who are doing this particularly well, there's Kirton, Sebago, and Aurélien. So if you want to, be trendy this summer, I'd recommend acting like you're a hand on deck, just wear whatever the crew's wearing.
How far is Florence from the nearest open water exactly?
That is a great question. I don't think it's that far. Italy's quite small. I'll look it up.
But do we have any sense at this early stage of this phenomenon as to what is driving it? Why do we all want to look like we're on yachts again, apparently?
Yeah, I wonder if it's because of, economic recessions, the rich getting richer, poor getting poorer. It feels very 80s, that yuppie lifestyle, the opulence, the flaunting of wealth. Maybe some of it isn't real. So I wonder if it is, an indicator of a recession.
On that cheerful thought, Monocle's Grace Charlton at Pitti Uomo in Florence, thank you for joining us. And that is all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Chris Chermak and Desiree Bandley here in Zurich. Our studio manager in London was Lily Austin. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time, 1300 Zurich, midday London. I'm Andrew Muller. I will be back with The Daily later today, 1900 Zurich, 1800 London. Thanks for listening.